Hello, this is the third lecture in a series of lectures on the principles and practice of using woody plants in the landscape as part of the Woody Landscape Plants course in the Prairie Hort Certificate Program. Today I want to talk about the landscape design process, in particular the goals of landscaping, and briefly touch on some of the aspects of the actual design process, the assessment plan. Now there are many goals in residential landscaping. Some of these, of course, relate back to some of the functions of landscape plants, which I discussed in an earlier lecture. The main goals that I'll be discussing are the so-called architectural goals of how to define the space use in the yard, aspects of privacy, comfort, identity and beauty, security, safety of the landscape. How hard is it or easy is it to maintain? So those are all aspects or goals that one has to consider when designing your landscape. Taking a look at the first one, the architectural aspect or goal, that really relates to how you define this use of space, and as I say, in 3 dimensions. You can consider the landscape as an outdoor room that has many functions. You have to consider, do you want it to be a place where you just relax and have a quiet moments, or do you want it to be a place of activity? Are there children in the yard? How are you going to get around the yard? You can see here there's a walkway to get around the yard. There can be all sorts of things in here that relate to the use of the landscape. It may also be related to practical things like storage and doing things like that. In terms of privacy, you have to consider that you can use plants to create privacy. We talked about that in terms of hedges and screens earlier on. But you've got to remember to balance the difference between privacy but not confinement. If your hedges or your plants get too big and enclosing, it can give you an awkward feeling. Comfort is a very important aspect of using plants in the landscape and making a landscape in your yard. And that is I had mentioned earlier that I would talk about protection from the wind, and that's one aspect that's very important, especially in open parts of the prairies, or if you're out in the country in the prairies. And of course, shelter belts, as you can see in this particular shot around the farmstead here, you can see that they've been very instrumental in being able to comfortably live in the prairies where there's a lot of wind. And so it not only is it comfortable to be out in it, but it even improves the ability to have aspects of horticulture like gardens and so on. So it does change quite a bit of the microclimate behind the shelter belt. In the urban area, wind protection may not be quite as big a deal, but shade is always a big problem. And I use these illustrations of these shots in Australia. I was at a conference years ago where the problem with the ozone layer being so thin around Australia and people with skin cancer is so great that shade is a big deal for a lot of people, and I was always encouraged to get out of the sun, get out of the sun. This is a market area in a part of Australia with these big eucalyptus trees. They've made sure that their market was placed underneath lots of shade. And you can see in this shot over here, out in the countryside, you can see that all the cows, a lot of them are finding their way to the shade, so they're naturally doing that. So of course we can use this aspect in our own landscaping. Identity and beauty is, of course, one of the main reasons why people want to landscape a yard. They want it to look nice. They want it to look nice for themselves, or perhaps for visitors or for the public. It can really if it's really stark or if it's really busy, it can really define who you are. Perhaps this is in the Toronto Islands, a house. It's really quite amazing amount of plant material here. One wonders if it looks like this inside their house. But it does define you, and it can say something about your personality. So it's definitely a major goal in landscaping as an expression of who you are. Another aspect of landscaping is to create sometimes more security or more safety in the landscape. It may be that the landscape helps to improve that, or you might want to make sure your landscape is safe with lots of lighting and good solid pathways that aren't dangerous and so on. But you can also use plants to create increased security. For example, this plant called Cherry Principia is a dense, thorny plant. It's so dense that it's been used in medians of highways, such that if cars come off and get into the median, they can actually bounce off them if they're growing in a row. So they're very dense. Sometimes people think about using these around areas where you don't want people, like say around basement windows, so burglars can't get through. The other thing is, of course, around basement windows, it's suggested you don't use anything so the burglars can't hide, so it's a bit of a trade-off. Another way of using it in terms of safety is to think about this little hedge growing between the lawn and the driveway, and if, say, there were children that tended to play here and there was a ball and the ball would roll out into the driveway, this hedge could stop that from happening. So it could be a way of added safety feature in that regard. Another particular important goal in landscaping is the whole area of maintenance. Some people like to spend a lot of time in their landscape. It's more a recreation to them maintaining it. Some people just want it to be in there and want to spend as little time as possible in it. So you really have to consider what you do when it comes to maintenance. There's lots of things to consider. Some plants are more prone to insect problems. Of course, lawns have to be mowed. Some kinds of apples and prunes and plums and so on produce suckers from the roots, and especially in this kind of lawn where it was pretty dry, these suckers are growing up. They have to be controlled. This can happen with other plants as well. So these are things to consider. And of course, if you have trees, they're great for shade, for beauty, and so on. But here's what you're faced with each fall. So you have to consider these things when you're thinking about your landscape. How much maintenance do you want to do? And this also is where the whole notion of xeriscaping, or using plants that are really adapted to dry climates, can be used, so you have less inputs that way as well. Okay, so the next part I want to talk about for the rest of these lectures really is the landscape design process itself, and we're going to be looking just today at the assessment of the landscape, as I said, but then we're going to move on to talk about the idea of making a concept plan, which I'll discuss in more detail. And then I want to talk a fair amount about principles of design. We've talked about design elements of color, textures, form, and line, but we're going to talk about the principles of design, which are a little different, which will be hopefully useful in your second assignment. And then I'll just talk very briefly about the idea of making a detailed plan and how that differs from a concept plan and an assessment plan. We'll have a bit of a discussion of that. So developing an assessment plan. What is an assessment plan? Simply speaking, that is a plan that shows what you already have. Basically, it can be just rather sketchy, and it's a good idea if you've taken a landscape that you're going to do a makeover on, especially, is to say, okay, what have I got there? What have I got in the way of buildings? What have I got in the way of everything else, from plants to anything else that you may have, such as specifically types of differences in the topography in the area, or how the elements are being exposed to the wind, and that sort of thing. So you've got to consider all aspects. So let's take a look at that. So it's really an inventory of existing features of the landscape. So it's not just the plant material, but all the buildings and all the hard surfaces such as driveways, sidewalks, decks, and so on have to be accounted for. So that's usually where you start. And of course, all the plant materials that are there should be identified, whether you're going to keep them or not. You should identify them, because then you can decide what to do next. And environmental site conditions, as I said, you can look at the conditions under which it's growing. You can look at places like high spots, low spots, where water collects. You might want to look at where utility lines are as well. Places where the wind is the worst, for example. So here's the wind. And so you can see this wet area, water line. And so you can see that you have to consider these things when you are developing an assessment plan. So an assessment plan is simply that kind of plan which gives you the starting point. It doesn't have to be in a lot of detail. This one's pretty detailed, but it might be a good idea to think about that before you start. It's the best way to start the whole process. But we will go on from there next time.